right now, Ursula, we have a guest, my friend.
We do, and we have been talking about hate crimes that have been directed at Asian Americans. They've skyrocketed 150% last year with over 3,800 reported incidents. And with what we're saying this year, that trend does not look to get any better anytime soon. So we want to know, as uncomfortable as this conversation is for some, we want to help educate ourselves and help let you understand. So we want to know, how did we get to this point? And joining us now to help us understand is Bob Chang. He's a civil rights attorney and the director of the Fred Korematsu Center at Seattle University. Good morning, Bob.
Good morning. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get into some of the history, we want to ask you, as an Asian American who has devoted your entire career to equality, what is your reaction to the shooting, the news of the shooting in Atlanta?
Gosh, my reaction, grief, horror, those really are the predominant emotions that I'm feeling.
And specifically talking about whether or not this is a hate crime, and we're getting blasted right now because I talked about it in the last hour, and Gee and I were saying, how could you not, look at it as a possible hate crime? How can you say that it's not one? And police haven't said it's not one, but they're looking at the whole idea that he is a sex addict and that was what his motive was. Your reaction to that narrative, though, that it isn't a hate crime just because it's Asian Americans who were targeted, it's not a hate crime.
Well, so I found it really curious, the spokesperson for the sheriff's department that's doing the investigation, and in some ways just how quickly he offered up the excuse about he was having a bad day, and this idea in some ways that the man was suffering from a sex addiction. And, the problem for me is that plays into so many of the stereotypes that exist. In some ways, it almost feels like the spokesperson is already engaging in a defense for the man that somehow race is not connected to this. And so that's where I come at this in terms of thinking about and understanding what it is that the spokesperson said.
When the history of these hate crimes, Bob, that have happened over the years, and just recently I just became aware and saw some of your work and some of all the cases that you have gone through and brought up. My question is, why has this not really been made available for us to know about when it comes to all of the history lessons and all of the things that the anti-Asian rhetoric that has happened throughout this history? Why aren't we really made aware of these things?
Well, part of it is the way that American history is taught in most schools. It tends really to be a story that excludes the stories of minorities. And so we shouldn't be surprised that the story of Asian Americans is not included. It was really interesting. Earlier today, the House Judiciary Committee heard testimony from people about discrimination, against Asian Americans. And one of the people testifying was Daniel Dae Kim. And he talked about it as the stories that he's trying to put out there. It's not Asian American history, it's American history. But the problem is that Asian American history is too often thought of or not included as American history. It's this side subject. The same thing goes with history, African American history. The same thing goes with history of Mexican Americans in this country. And so if these stories aren't included, then it's not surprising then that people aren't aware of this. I mean, in terms of thinking about Washington's own history, Washington has a long history of anti-Asian sentiment and actions. Going back to the very terrible riots in Tacoma and Seattle in 1885 and 1886, when Chinese persons were sort of corralled and taken to the docks to be removed from Tacoma and Seattle.
Going forward, what do you think more needs to be done to make us more aware and or help with the conversation to make things better in this country for Asian Americans?
Well, certainly being made more aware is critical to this effort. So when the former president talks about things like the Chinese flu or the Chinese virus or Kung flu, it's able to take hold and affect people because of the way that persons of Asian ancestry are regarded as always foreign. In some ways, new versions of the previous yellow peril. And so if people don't understand this history and the way that those words have power because of this history, and in some ways, it's not all just ancient history. It's something that has persisted throughout this nation's history. In some ways, when we think about the number of Asian Americans in this country, I think, Gee, you on Twitter, you noticed one of the slides that I had put up. Why does America look the way that it does? And it's because by deliberate design, people from Asia and Africa were kept out.
Talk about that, Bob, because you say kept out. I mean, there was a disproportionate number of Europeans who were allowed in versus Asians and Africans. I mean, and there was kind of a striking number as of a particular date. I believe it was in the 1960s, although obviously many things have changed since then.
Sure. So part of the history of exclusion into Asian exclusion goes back earlier, and part of the blame for this also comes from a Washington representative, Albert Johnson. He was a sponsor of the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration and Nationality Act. And what Congress did is it decided that it wanted a certain vision of what America was, and it determined immigration and country quotas based on what America looked like in 1890. And so it's from that point in time that you get the quotas that were put into place that persisted and didn't change until 1965.
Bob, we appreciate your time. I know that there's a lot more that we can discuss. We sure appreciate your time. Thank you for lending your insights and for the work that you've done on such an important topic. We appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
That is Bob Chang, civil rights attorney and the director of the Fred Korematsu Center at Seattle University.